In a country fighting one of the deadliest wars in the Sahel, a former leader returns not as a savior, but as a reckoning. The road between Lomé and Ouagadougou is not long on a map, yet in the politics of the Sahel it can stretch for years. For more than 3 years, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba lived in exile in Togo, a former head of state displaced by force, carrying with him the unresolved weight of a broken transition. He had seized power briefly, then lost it just as abruptly in October 2022, pushed aside by another rupture inside a nation already bleeding from war. For a long time, his presence in Togo existed in a grey zone, tolerated, watched, debated, but untouched. Then suddenly, the silence broke. In January 2026, reports emerged that Damiba had been arrested on Togolese soil and sent back to Ouagadougou. No dramatic images, no public handcuffs, just a quiet transfer that immediately ignited a regional storm. Was this an expulsion, or was it an extradition? The distinction matters, not only legally, but symbolically. According to the accounts discussed in the broadcast, Togolese judicial authorities had held a hearing at the Court of Appeal on the Friday preceding the transfer. The court did not issue a ruling in the classic sense. Instead, it delivered what is known in extradition procedures as an opinion, a legal assessment that enables but does not force the executive to act. The final decision, as always in such cases, remained political. This procedural detail became the hinge of the story. For years, the authorities in Ouagadougou had accused Damiba of colluding with dissident officers, operating from abroad, and maintaining links with external powers hostile to the current leadership. These accusations circulated widely on social media and in regional commentary, but critics repeatedly asked the same question: where was the evidence? In the past, none had been made public. Now the narrative shifted. The broadcast claims that testimonies from alleged accomplices were finally obtained, accounts said to describe step by step the planning of destabilization efforts, including plots targeting both political leaders and senior officers. The ultimate objective, according to these testimonies, was not negotiation or return through dialogue, but the retaking of power by force. No official documents were shown during the program. No indictments were read aloud. What the audience received instead was something more powerful in the current Sahelian climate: a moral framing. Planning violence during a war against terrorism was portrayed not as political rivalry, but as betrayal. Not as ambition, but as sabotage. The argument was simple and relentless. When a nation is under attack, any internal fracture becomes a weapon in the hands of its enemies. The timing intensified the message. Burkina Faso remains locked in an asymmetric war against armed groups operating across vast rural spaces. Entire regions have slipped beyond consistent state control. Military convoys move cautiously. Villages live with the daily fear of attack. In this context, even the hint of an internal conspiracy resonates like a spark near dry grass. The program repeatedly returned to one central question: why now? The answer offered was not coincidence, but accumulation. Years of surveillance, negotiation, warnings, and diplomatic restraint had reached their limit. Togo, long seen as a country willing to offer refuge for humanitarian reasons, was presented as having been pushed into a corner. Hosting a political exile is one thing. Hosting a figure accused of active destabilization, the argument went, is another. A metaphor emerged during the discussion, simple but sharp. You may shelter a child fleeing a storm, but you cannot keep him if he throws stones at the neighbor's house from under your roof. In this telling, the transfer of Damiba was not a hostile act between neighbors, but a clarification, a line drawn, a signal that refuge does not mean immunity, and exile does not grant a license to conspire. Yet uncertainty lingers. Was the evidence decisive or merely sufficient? Was the court's opinion decisive or a convenient legal cover? And most importantly, does returning one man truly neutralize a network, or does it merely expose how deep the fractures already run? The road between Lomé and Ouagadougou has now been crossed, but whether it leads to justice, stability, or further confrontation remains unanswered. And that is where the story truly begins. Because if this transfer was not the end of a chapter, but the opening of a larger reckoning, who else is still moving in the shadows? When the news broke, it did not land like a verdict. It landed like a shockwave. Across Ouagadougou, Lomé, and far beyond the Sahel, reactions split instantly into two currents: disbelief and vindication. For some, the return of Damiba confirmed long-held suspicions whispered in private and shouted online. For others, it raised a darker fear, that the region was entering a phase where politics, justice, and war were collapsing into one volatile equation. The emotional peak of the broadcast came not from legal details, but from a moral line drawn in bold ink. To plan violence, the analysts argued, while soldiers and civilians were already dying daily in a war against insurgents, crossed a boundary that could not be relativized. This was no longer framed as a dispute between former allies, nor as a wounded pride seeking restoration. It was framed as an existential threat, a knife raised not against a rival, but against the fragile spine of a nation under siege. The name most often invoked was not the accused, but the target. According to the narrative presented, alleged plots went beyond destabilization and into the realm of assassination. The mere suggestion of such intent elevated the story from political intrigue to moral outrage. In a country where leadership is tied directly to survival on the battlefield, the idea of removing a commander in the midst of war was portrayed as reckless, even suicidal. This is where the story reached its emotional crest. The broadcast contrasted two images. On one side, villages emptied by fear, soldiers stretched thin, and families burying their dead. On the other, clandestine meetings, whispered alliances and ambitions nourished far from the front lines. The contrast was brutal, and deliberately so. They called it politics, the subtext implied. We call it betrayal. Media reactions mirrored this polarity. Some regional outlets focused narrowly on procedure, extradition versus expulsion, court opinions, diplomatic choreography. Others amplified the symbolic weight of the moment, calling it a turning point in how Sahelian states would handle internal threats operating from abroad. Headlines oscillated between restraint and accusation, often within the same 24 hours. On social media, the temperature rose sharply. Togo, which had long maintained a reputation as a quiet mediator and refuge, found itself accused of playing a double game. Had it protected a destabilizing actor for years? Or had it exercised restraint until restraint became complicity? The broadcast's guest dismissed the ambiguity. According to his account, warnings had been issued, lines had been drawn, and patience had expired. In this telling, Togo's decision was framed not as submission to pressure, but as an act of responsibility. Neutrality, the argument went, has limits, especially when neutrality begins to erode the security of neighbors. Yet the reaction was not uniform. Skeptics questioned the sudden clarity of evidence. If testimonies existed, why now? If networks were known, why had they been allowed to mature? These questions hovered in the background, acknowledged but never fully explored, creating a tension between certainty and doubt that the broadcast did not resolve. Another layer of reaction emerged from within the military sphere. Rumors of internal fractures resurfaced almost immediately. Had this affair exposed lingering loyalties, unresolved grievances, or competing visions within the armed forces themselves? The analyst pushed back firmly, portraying the army as largely unified, disciplined, and focused, while conceding the existence of marginal elements driven by jealousy or bitterness. The enemy, he insisted, remained external. Armed groups sustained by foreign interests hostile to African self-determination. This framing shifted the crescendo from an internal drama to a geopolitical indictment. Western powers were accused, not through direct evidence, but through a familiar Sahelian narrative, of profiting from instability, of feeding insurgency indirectly, and of fearing a domino effect should Sahelian states reclaim full sovereignty. Whether or not this claim withstands scrutiny, its emotional power is undeniable. It offers a simple explanation for a complex war. Instability is not accidental. It is managed. By the end of the segment, the audience was no longer asked to judge a man. They were asked to choose a side. Service versus ambition. Unity versus ego. War for survival versus politics as usual. And yet, beneath the certainty, one unresolved tension remained. If justice is real, it must be seen. If guilt is proven, it must withstand scrutiny. And if innocence exists, it must be allowed to speak. The broadcast concluded this phase by asserting confidence in a forthcoming trial, calling for fairness while simultaneously affirming the seriousness of the accusations. It was a delicate balancing act, one that revealed just how thin the line had become between reassurance and mobilization. The crescendo had been reached, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Because once a nation decides that silence is no longer an option, the next question is unavoidable. What price will truth demand from its people? When a former head of state is brought back under accusation, the consequences do not stop at courtrooms. They ripple outward, into markets, villages, barracks, and living rooms where fear and hope already coexist uneasily. For ordinary citizens, the affair landed on ground that was already cracked. Burkina Faso has lived for years under the pressure of an asymmetric war, that blurs the line between frontline and home. Farmers abandon fields before harvest. Traders travel only in convoys. Schools close not because of budgets, but because teachers and children alike fear the road. In this environment, security is not an abstract concept. It is the difference between planting and fleeing, between staying and surviving. The return of Damiba intensified an existing anxiety, the sense that the enemy is not only at the periphery, but may also operate from within. For many civilians, the story reinforced a grim conviction that instability is prolonged not merely by armed groups in the bush, but by hidden hands closer to the center. The idea that plots could be coordinated from exile fed a narrative of siege, where the nation feels surrounded by visible attackers and invisible conspirators. This perception carries consequences. Communities already traumatized by violence become more suspicious, more polarized. Accusations spread faster than evidence. Trust, already fragile, thins further. In such conditions, even calls for vigilance can slide into fear-driven judgment, especially in areas where the state's presence is intermittent and protection uneven. The political consequences are just as complex. For the authorities, the transfer of Damiba was framed as a necessary act of containment, a way to seal a breach before it widened. It sent a clear message that the era of tolerated ambiguity was over. In a time of war, neutrality toward alleged destabilization would no longer be acceptable. This message resonated strongly with a population exhausted by insecurity. Public discourse increasingly favors firmness over dialogue, action over patience. The idea of reconciliation, once central to post-coup narratives, now competes with a harsher logic. Survival first, justice later. For many, this is not ideological, it is visceral. Within the armed forces, the implications cut deeper. The war has elevated the military to the center of national life. Soldiers are not distant figures, they are sons, daughters, neighbors. Losses are felt collectively. Against this backdrop, any suggestion of internal complicity strikes at the heart of cohesion. Analysts in the broadcast downplayed the existence of deep fractures, portraying the army as largely unified and focused. Yet even this reassurance acknowledges a truth. Unity must be constantly defended. In prolonged conflict, discipline is tested not only by bullets, but by rumors, grievances, and fatigue. The Damiba affair thus becomes more than a legal process. It becomes a loyalty test. Who stands unequivocally with the war effort? Who hesitates? And who benefits from hesitation? Politically, this moment strengthens the legitimacy of a leadership that presents itself as the guardian of national survival. The narrative is straightforward. The state is rebuilding itself under fire, and any attempt to destabilize that process is an attack on the people themselves. In this framing, Ibrahim Traoré appears not simply as a ruler, but as a symbol of continuity in chaos, a figure around whom expectations of order, security, and dignity have coalesced. Support for the leadership is therefore less about ideology and more about perceived necessity. Yet such consolidation carries risks. When political authority draws its strength primarily from security imperatives, space for dissent narrows. Critics risk being conflated with enemies. Questions risk being interpreted as sabotage. Over time, this can erode the very social fabric that security measures aim to protect. The civilian cost of this tension is subtle but real. People learn to speak carefully, to listen more than they talk, to measure words against consequences. At the same time, there is hope, cautious, restrained, but persistent. Many citizens view the removal of a destabilizing figure as a chance to focus finally on the essentials. Restoring access to land, reopening schools, securing roads, and rebuilding trust between the state and communities. The belief is simple. Fewer shadows mean clearer paths forward. But belief alone cannot end a war. The Damiba case has raised expectations that justice will be visible, fair, and decisive. A trial perceived as opaque or politicized would deepen cynicism rather than restore confidence. Conversely, a process seen as credible could mark a rare moment of institutional strength in a region weary of impunity. This is the crossroads. If handled well, the affair could reinforce social cohesion and political stability by demonstrating that accountability exists even at the highest levels. If mishandled, it could inflame suspicion, entrench fear, and harden divisions already etched by years of violence. The consequences then are not fixed. They are being shaped in real time, by courts, by leaders, and by the silent calculations of ordinary people deciding whether to trust, to endure, or to withdraw. Because the fate of one man may soon give way to a larger question: how the world beyond the borders chooses to respond to a nation redefining its own rules. No security crisis in the Sahel exists in isolation. Borders may be drawn on maps, but instability travels lightly, across deserts, through markets, and into diplomatic chambers far from the front lines. The return of Damiba immediately reframed the conversation beyond national boundaries. What appeared at first glance as a domestic security measure quickly became a regional signal, scrutinized by neighboring states, continental organizations, and global powers with long-standing interests in West Africa. African institutions responded with caution. The African Union and ECOWAS, both already navigating strained relations with several Sahelian governments, maintained a studied restraint. No urgent communiques, no dramatic condemnations. Their silence reflected a delicate balancing act, acknowledging state sovereignty while avoiding endorsement of actions that could later be questioned on legal or political grounds. This restraint was not neutrality, it was calculation. For years, regional bodies have struggled to reconcile two competing realities: the urgency of security and the norms of constitutional order. In a context where coups, transitions, and counter-terrorism operations overlap, every precedent matters. The Damiba case added another layer to this uneasy equation. Beyond the continent, the reaction was shaped less by statements and more by narratives. Western media largely framed the event through familiar lenses: instability, military rule, and the risks of authoritarian consolidation. Legal terminology dominated coverage, with emphasis on due process, extradition norms, and the rights of the accused. Yet beneath this procedural focus lay a deeper concern: predictability. For external partners, the Sahel has long been viewed as both a security buffer and a resource corridor. Persistent conflict threatens not only local populations, but broader strategic calculations. A region asserting tighter control over its internal threats disrupts established assumptions about influence, mediation, and leverage. It is within this context that the case resonates beyond one individual. Burkina Faso sits at the center of a shifting geopolitical landscape where alliances are being reconsidered and old dependencies openly challenged. The message implied by the transfer was not subtle. Political exile will no longer function as a shield against accountability, and neighboring states will be expected to take clearer positions. For some observers, this signals maturation. African states resolving African crises through their own mechanisms. For others, it raises alarms about the erosion of safeguards in environments where power is already concentrated. The role of the United States and the European Union has been notably indirect. Rather than public condemnation or endorsement, their engagement has remained embedded in broader discourses on regional stability, counter-terrorism cooperation, and human rights monitoring. This distance reflects both caution and uncertainty. Supporting security efforts without legitimizing controversial political processes has become an increasingly narrow path to walk. At the heart of these international reactions lies a shared question: does this moment represent the consolidation of sovereignty or the normalization of exceptional measures justified by war? The answer matters not only for diplomats, but for neighboring governments watching closely. Precedents travel quickly in the Sahel. What is accepted today in one capital may be invoked tomorrow in another. The Damiba affair, therefore, functions as more than a national episode. It is a test case for regional solidarity, for continental norms, and for how the world responds when African states choose decisiveness over ambiguity. Because if the international community hesitates to define its stance, the next chapter will be written not in press releases, but in the choices these nations make alone. The future rarely announces itself with certainty. It arrives through pressure points, moments when choice replaces delay and consequence replaces speculation. The return of Damiba has created one such pressure point. For the authorities, the path forward appears defined by urgency. The priority remains clear: contain destabilization, maintain military cohesion, and prevent any perception of weakness while the war against insurgent groups continues. In this logic, firmness is not optional, it is survival. Any hesitation risks being interpreted not as restraint, but as vulnerability. Yet firmness alone cannot secure a nation indefinitely. The real challenge lies in what follows containment. Trials must move beyond symbolism. Justice must be seen, not merely declared. A process perceived as opaque or selective would feed the very narratives of grievance and conspiracy that fuel instability. Conversely, a process grounded in transparency could recalibrate expectations across the political spectrum. This is where risk and opportunity intersect. Handled wisely, the case could establish a new norm: that leadership, even former leadership, is accountable not only to history but to institutions. that exile does not suspend responsibility, that ambition cannot outrun consequence. Such a precedent would resonate far beyond one courtroom, shaping behavior across a region where unresolved transitions have too often recycled conflict. Handled poorly, however, the consequences could be corrosive. Marginalized supporters may radicalize. Doubt could deepen within communities already exhausted by war. And the line between necessary security measures and permanent exception could blur, narrowing civic space at the very moment national unity is most needed. Beyond the immediate legal process, the road ahead also demands strategic recalibration. Military operations alone cannot defeat insurgency rooted in geography, poverty, and historical neglect. Security must be paired with restoration of roads, schools, markets, and trust. Communities that feel protected but unheard will not hold indefinitely. Stability requires more than control, it requires consent. There is also a regional dimension. Neighboring states are watching closely. If cooperation replaces ambiguity, the Sahel could see a gradual closing of safe corridors for destabilizing actors. If hesitation returns, old patterns will reassert themselves. The difference between these outcomes lies not in declarations, but in consistency. At its core, the moment poses a deeper question. What does sovereignty look like under fire? Is it defined by the capacity to act decisively, or by the discipline to bind that action to principles that endure beyond war? Can a nation defend itself without becoming hostage to permanent emergency? For many citizens, the answer is pragmatic. They seek an end to fear, not philosophical purity. Yet history suggests that how a state fights often shapes what it becomes when the fighting ends. The road ahead is therefore not a straight line. It is a narrow passage between necessity and restraint, urgency and justice, survival and vision. The choices made now will echo long after the headlines fade. Because when a nation stands at the edge of transformation, the final question is no longer about one man, but about what kind of future is being claimed. History is rarely moved by noise. It shifts when quiet decisions redraw the limits of what is tolerated. The return of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba was one such decision, not because of who he is alone, but because of what his return represents in a region long shaped by unfinished transitions and borrowed solutions. In a land marked by grief and endurance, the message was unmistakable. Ambiguity has a cost, and exile is no longer a sanctuary from consequence. For years, the Sahel has been spoken about rather than listened to. Plans were written abroad, strategies imported, patience demanded from those who could least afford it. Yet in moments like this, a different voice emerges, one that insists on agency, even when the choices are heavy and the risks unforgiving. This is not a story of vengeance. It is a story of limits. Limits to how long instability can be externalized. Limits to how often sovereignty can be postponed in the name of procedure. Limits to the idea that African nations must wait for permission to secure themselves. Within this reckoning stands Ibrahim Traoré, not as a myth, but as a symbol of expectation. To some, he represents order in chaos. To others, a test of whether firmness can coexist with justice. Symbols, however, are fragile. They demand proof not through words but through outcomes that endure beyond crisis. The road ahead will be unforgiving. Courts must speak clearly. Institutions must hold. Power must resist the temptation to confuse necessity with permanence. Only then can security become more than survival, and authority become more than command. What is unfolding is larger than one trial or one transfer. It is a contest between old patterns and emerging resolve, between dependency and self-definition, between silence and choice. Burkina Faso now stands at a crossroads that many nations before it have faced, but few have navigated cleanly. The path chosen will not only shape its own future, but send ripples across a continent watching closely, measuring what is possible. And this is where the story turns outward. If one nation, battered by war and doubt, dares to redraw the rules of accountability, what does that mean for the rest? If sovereignty is claimed not in slogans but in difficult action, how far can that example travel? This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a reckoning. If this moment matters to you, if dignity, responsibility, and the future of African self-determination resonate beyond headlines, stay with this conversation. Subscribe, share, and add your voice. Because history does not move alone. It moves when people choose to walk with it. And as the dust settles, one truth remains clear. The choices made now will define not only leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, but the generations that inherit what comes next.